Today in Across the Fence, we're going to learn about blue-green algae in Lake Champlain and how you can join other citizen scientists to reduce the spread and frequency of the algae and its dangerous toxins. Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. Blue and green algae blooms have gotten a lot of public attention, in part because of the potential health dangers, but not all algae blooms are blue-greens, and not all blue-green blooms are toxic. So, to sort things out, we've called on a scientist with extensive experience studying Lake Champlain and blue-green algae blooms. It's a pleasure to welcome Mike Winslow. Mike has spent more than a decade as a staff scientist with the Lake Champlain Committee. Welcome. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start out pretty basically. What is blue-green algae?
So blue-green algae are actually a bacteria. They have the ability to photosynthesize, so they live in the lake. They're there naturally as part of the system. But because they're a bacteria, and they sometimes produce toxins, and that's what leads to concern about them. They tend to dominate in water conditions where there's high nutrient levels, and particularly phosphorus. At other times, in the absence of the phosphorus, different sorts of algae that don't produce toxins will be there. Mm-hmm. There's different species of blue-green algae, some of which produce one type of toxin, some of which produce another type of toxin, some of which don't have any toxins at all. And by looking at a bloom, you can't tell which one you have.
Okay.
So what we've been doing is just trying to train people to recognize what blue-green algae blooms are and then avoid all of them.
Okay. You brought along some photos that'll help us understand what the blooms look like.
Sure, that's right. I did.
If we can take a look at those, maybe.
So this is a algae bloom on the surface of the water. You'll notice there's not any structure to it. If you were to pick up even those larger green spots in there, they would just sort of fall apart. It would be like having paint on your hand. There was a picture at the beginning of the session of a widespread bloom with a person sitting in it, and that's the sort of pea soup image that you would see with a bloom conditions. That picture. So here you've got this pea soup area. It's all green. That is a fairly extensive bloom right there. But again, if you were to try to pick up anything, which isn't recommended because they do produce toxins, you would end up more like with paint on your hand than actually holding anything.
So it's not like you could skim it away.
Exactly. As the blooms are just beginning to develop, you get a situation more like this, with just these pinhead-size green fuzz balls floating in the water. Now, this would be not quite a bloom, but these are blue-green algae. They're present in the water system, and if the day gets a little bit warmer, if it's calm, they'll come together at the surface and form that condition that we saw in the earlier picture. This is a bloom that occurred earlier this year on the Burlington shoreline. You can see in this picture a little more of the blue color, this turquoise blue. That turquoise blue is indicative of blue-green algae. There's nothing else that really produces that color in nature. That color kind of develops as the bloom begins to break down and some of the pigments are being released. And this is also the time when, as the cells are breaking down, the toxins may be released as well. Let's
talk a little bit about the health concerns. What are the toxin content of blue-green algae? Because as you mentioned, or mentioned earlier, not all algae has toxins.
There's two strains of toxins that we've seen in Lake Champlain. One strain is damages the liver if taken in large concentrations over a period of time. That's produced by the algae that we see most often in the northeastern portion of the lake. The other strain, the other toxins when they occur, attack the nervous system. Now again, when I say attack the liver or attack the nervous system, those are usually only in large concentrations over a large period of time. The worst effects that we've seen in this area is about 10 years ago, some of the nervous system toxins were imbibed by some dogs, and we lost 2 or 3 dogs that had eaten it. We think the dogs are more susceptible in part because they'll swim in places where people won't.
Right.
And also when they get out of the water, they'll lick their fur, so they're getting a much larger dose of the toxins.
So for a person to get sick, they'd have to really ingest a lot of this.
That's right. The worst case that we would see with people is stomach aches, for the most part. So far, we haven't linked anything more than stomach aches to this. They'll also, people who swim in the toxins will get itchy sometimes, itchy skin. And actually that's not necessarily caused by the toxins, but by other chemicals in the algae. It's a separate piece.
Well, the good news is when you see it, it's not that inviting and you don't feel like swimming in it or being in it.
That's what we think, but part of the challenge is that the blooms are more likely to occur when it's really, really hot.
I was going to ask you what triggers the blooms.
Yeah, so first you have to have the right conditions to start with. We think of it as setting the table. You have to have high enough nutrient concentrations that the algae can take advantage of those nutrients and grow. But then there are other things that will spur them from going from just there, the pinheads, to a full-grown bloom. And temperature and calm weather are two of those things that are really required. So when you get these early heat waves in June, July, that's when we see blooms in the Burlington area in particular. And that's also when people most want to be using the lake. So it's a terrible contradiction or irony. Are
there places on the lake where the blooms are more likely to occur?
We see blooms occasionally in the Burlington area every 3 to 4 years, widespread in isolated areas regularly. But the place they occur most often is Missisquoi Bay. And this is a picture of Missisquoi Bay. And the one thing you really notice from this picture is the horizon. There are no mountains. Unlike most places on the lake, when you look off onto the horizon, you see mountains. Here, Missisquoi Bay is really flat. The landscape's flat. The bay itself is no more than 17 feet deep. It's a very large area, very shallow, gets nutrient input from a huge watershed. And so that means it just has a lot more nutrient concentration there than anywhere else. Plus, because it's shallow and there's not a lot of water, it gets a lot warmer. So that's the place where we see blooms practically every year.
Are the blooms increasing in frequency?
It's a difficult question to answer. We've been studying blue-green algae blooms and toxins on Lake Champlain since the early 2003 or so, maybe a little bit before that. Lake Champlain Committee since 2003, a little bit before that. So we don't have great records of what it was like any earlier than that. We've got a couple smaller studies, 1 year piece of information that just looked at what the conditions were but didn't answer whether there's blooms or not. We suspect that blooms may be increasing in frequency, though we can't say it for sure. And the reasons we suspect that is, based on the older data, we see more of the bloom-producing species in the Missisquoi Bay type area than we did in those earlier studies. And then the other piece is we know the lake's warming, that the temperatures have been warmer around the area, and higher temperatures lead to more bloom conditions. So we suspect they're increasing, but can't say that for certain.
Now, we've had extensive spring flooding in the past year, and of course, Tropical Storm Irene. How has that affected the lake and the blooms? Do you know?
We know that the spring flooding and Irene brought in a lot more nutrients to the lake. And so because of that, we expect that there's more fuel, there's more food for the algae to bloom. Phosphorus, the thing that they're depending on the most, is a really complicated element. It combines with lots of stuff, and it isn't always available to the algae, so we can't be certain that the spring flooding will lead to blooms this year, but we did see blooms this year. It's complicated because it's been so hot this year as well.
Right. So what can we do to prevent blooms?
Well, what we ask most people to do is just look at what's going on around them and their own watershed and their own personal household. The more that we can slow down water around a household, the less that's getting into the lakes and the rivers and the streams, the less phosphorus is going to run off. We've produced a lake protection pledge at our website, lakechamplaincommittee.org, that lists in things that people can do to reduce pollution.
And now we're seeing a picture here because it's important for people to know what blue-green algae is and isn't.
Yes. So the picture right here is actually not blue-green algae. This is pollen. And pollen is one of the most difficult things to distinguish between blue-green algae because it has the same sort of oily consistency as the algae. But unlike algae, the pollen is yellow, and the blue-green algae will be blue to blue-green. Pollen also occurs earlier in the season. This picture here is green algae. So these are not toxin-producing species. And the way you would distinguish this from blue-green algae is if you were to take a stick and try to lift this up, you would get stringy material hanging off the stick. Whereas with the blue-green algae, you'd end up more like paint dripping off. And then this picture is a mixture of different plants. none of which are blue-green algae. In the foreground, there's some duckweed. And duckweed's a very tiny vascular plant, but if you were to get a look at it really closely, you would see individual leaves, whereas the blue-green algae, you wouldn't see anything distinctive if you looked at it up close.
It's just a mass.
It's just, yeah.
Now you have something called the Lake Champlain Committee's Blue-Green Algae Monitoring Program. How does that work?
That's correct. We have blue-green algae monitors. We've trained over 100 monitors this year. They go out and they observe water conditions once per week and report back to us by midweek about what they're seeing. The monitors are trained to distinguish blue-green algae from other sorts of algae, and by reporting back, we feed that information to the Department of Environmental Conservation, the Department of Health, and they get a picture of where blooms are occurring on the lake every year. We get between 40 and 50 reports each week during the summer.
Well, joining us now is Alan Carpenter of South Burlington, and you're one of the citizen scientist volunteers who goes out and monitors the lake for blue-green algae. How did you get involved in this program?
Well, at a later age in life, I decided to go back to school at the University of Vermont, and I got involved in the Bachelor of Science program in environmental studies, and I took a course from Mike, who was a professor in environmental science at the university, and he introduced me to the Lake Champlain Committee and ultimately to the testing program.
Now, how long have you been testing?
I've been actually out on the lake, going out on the lake every week for about 3 years now.
And so what's involved? How long does it take you to do the testing?
Well, initially we would actually go out and collect water samples, which we brought back to the lab at the Echo Center. And this year we've changed the program a little bit so that we do more observation, so that there's not so much actual getting of samples, except if there's a condition that requires that. It requires about an hour and a half every week.
But you're out on the lake.
For one, yes, right. For one testing, one site.
We made that change in the program to go away from the actual water quality sampling and more to a visual approach because conditions change so quickly. We're finding that by the time we got samples to the lab and got the results back, the lake may be completely different than what we had seen before. Additionally, because we're going to just a visual approach now, we can accept a lot more people into the program. We were limited by the ability of the labs to process samples. So we had 15 to 20 monitors last year and in previous years. This year we can have as many as are willing to participate.
So Alan, in the past few years, have you noticed a change in the lake?
I've been doing the Burlington area and mainly the Red Rocks area because I live in South Burlington and it's in close proximity to my house. And at Red Rocks, the past, up until this year, we really hadn't seen much in the way of algae blooms. But this year, the first time I went out, we had algae blooms. And so I'd say, yeah, it seems to be changing, and not for the better.
Yeah, and so Mike, how can people get involved in the training if they're interested?
Well, our website has information. We have most of the training materials available to look at on the website, but we'd actually ask people to set up a training with me. We'll come to places and provide that, and it's always helpful if you have a group of people that are interested. But even if you haven't undergone the training, there is a reporting form on our website, and you can just, if you happen to see a bloom, or even if you don't, it's worthwhile to report that there are clear conditions as well. So you can go to LakeChamplainCommittee.org, and within our volunteer section, blue-green algae monitoring section, there's a reporting form.
And tell me how important it is for you to have this information.
Well, without the volunteer monitors out there looking at the lake, we can't be everywhere at all times. So we're guiding health advisories around the lake. And an important part of it for me is also learning over time where the blooms aren't taking place. Blue-green algae garner a lot of attention when they're there. They don't get as much attention when they're not there, and that's part of what I want the overall monitoring program to inform us of in the years to come.
Okay, before we're out of time, I just want to mention that I want to give you a quick reminder of the website. It's the LakeChamplainCommittee.org. You can find information about the volunteer monitoring program as well as a wealth of other information about Lake Champlain. And you know, once again, as you mentioned, it's pretty easy to help out and to volunteer your time, and the information that you get from these volunteers is very important.
It certainly is.
All right, well, I want to thank you both for coming in and talking about it.
Thank you.
That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.
For a video copy of today's program, call toll-free 1-888-ATF-3430. Across the Fence is brought to you as a public service by University of Vermont Extension and WCAX-TV.